who's leading the modeling work in the TSITICA project. And I think there are already quite a few people here. So I think we're good to start. Faaiqa, whenever you're ready. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Britta. Good afternoon, everybody. Today I hope to provide you with a brief introduction to CG models and how they work. And I will also be showing you 3 examples relevant to the TSITICA project of how these models have been applied to climate change and climate action analysis. So I want to start off just by noting that the materials presented here pull on a number of resources, but greatly so from the training materials that have been developed by Rob Davies from Zimbabwe and Dirk van Seventer from South Africa, but who currently now resides in New Zealand. Rob and Dirk provide CG modeling course through TIPS and also have done so for IFPRI and UN wider. The presentation also pulls on or CG modeling courses from the Asia Pacific Research and Training Network, the manual for the IFPRI CG model, as well as a manual by James Thurlow on dynamic CGE modeling. So to start, let's talk about economy-wide models. So like all models, economy-wide models are abstracts of reality. They're economy-wide because they aim to capture the full economy, including the relationships between various agents in the economy. And these include firms, households, enterprises, government, and international trading partners. Economy-wide models are based on national data, which include macroeconomic and sector data from the national accounts, but also supplying use data, which provide information about the trades between economic agents. Economy-wide models provide a tool for the analysis of questions that have significant spillover or feedback effects that one cannot capture from other methodologies, such as partial equilibrium analysis. And they also aim to answer questions that are of interest or which are interested in the larger economic impacts. So there are different types of economy-wide tools that are available, but today I'll be focusing on CG models specifically. So what are CG models? They are large-scale numerical models which combine economic theory with real economic data. They are structural models which capture the full economy through the use of actual data, but they're also based on microeconomic theory with producers and consumers maximizing profits and utility consumption and utility respectively. At the same time, CG models respect macroeconomic constraints through the use of factor and macroeconomic closure rules. An example of this is total investment in the economy, which cannot exceed the amount of funds available for investment. And in the CG model, this is captured through total savings. So I'll touch a bit more on closure rules a little later. CG models simulate the functioning of a market economy, and they go beyond other economy-wide techniques because they include prices, behavior, and also non-linear relationships. Because of the size of the models and the number of interlinking relationships, they are generally solved computationally. So why do we use them? They have accounting and theoretical consistency. They capture the backward and forward linkages. They provide a broad scope, so they cover many institutions in the economy. They provide a consistent framework for the assessment of multiple policy relevant indicators. And because of the complexity, they provide a richer analysis than other economy-wide techniques. They are able to analyze trade-offs between efficiency and equity distribution issues, and are also flexible enough to handle a large range of policy issues. So CG models have been applied to questions of trade, taxation, public expenditure, etc. In addition, they can also be extended or combined with other models to provide more robust analysis and also to broaden the range of topics that they can look at. An example of this is the South African energy linked economic model. A key strength of CG models is that through using the model, it enables you to think about the impacts of shocks and policy changes in the economy by thinking about the linkages between various actors. They do, however, have limitations. As I mentioned, some of these can be overcome through linking with other models. But in general, CG models are faced with issues of difficulties around model selection, parameter specification, and functional form selection. There can be issues in terms of data consistency, which can create calibration problems. The model is not a statistical, or there's not a statistical test of model specification. Rather, the model is solved deterministically, although it does include elasticities that are econometrically estimated. The model is quite complex, so it does require dedicated resources to maintain, develop, and run the model. It doesn't include, because the model is it's a monetary model, it doesn't include non-monetary metrics. So for example, thinking about the impacts of improved air quality is something that one would need to exogenously include into the model through one of the other variables. It is a real model of economic flows, so it doesn't account for financial market effects, although there have been increasing efforts into building financial CG models, which can take this into account. And then CG models are also based on a historical representation of country monetary flows. So the destruction or transformation of existing industries or the creation of new industries is not something that's endogenous, but rather something that we include depending on the question that we're looking at. The one thing I do want to note is that CG models are not forecasting tools, but rather they are simulatory tools that enable the analysis of shocks or policy changes relative to a counterfactual, which is calibrated on using economic forecasts for the country or region that you're looking at. So when do we use CG models? So given the strength and limitations of the models, they are appropriate to some but not all types of questions. They're often used when policy questions involve large changes that are well outside of historical experiences. So this generally tends to suggest that you need a simulation technique to look at these types of questions. They are used when the questions involve multiple countries, multiple sectors, which indicates the need for a general equilibrium approach rather than a partial equilibrium approach. They're also used when the question involves one sector, but that sector is large enough to have impacts on the overall economy. So then it becomes important to understand those spillover effects. And then also if you're interested in the detailed information on or detailed impacts on the economic system and not just the broad economic aggregates. So there are different types of CG models. You get CG models which are neoclassical or Keynesian or in structure or perhaps a combination of the two. There are CG models that are based on perfect competition, but you also get ones that are based on imperfect competition. You get models that have detailed modules, for example, on energy or water or agriculture. You get CG models that are static, which means that they're one-period models, or they're dynamic, which enables an analysis over time. And then you also get CG models at different levels of the economy. So, for example, you could get local, regional, or global CG models depending on the data that is available. CG models are often coded in two key programming languages. These are namely GANS and GMPAC, although there have been some models that have been built in Excel. In South Africa, there are generally 4 types of CG models that are in use. These are the IFPRI models, the Orani-G models, there are the PIP models, and then there are GTAP models, which are global CG models, particularly used for trade. So in this presentation, I'll focus on the IFPRI type models. So like all models, CG models have inputs which feed into the model and then provide some types of outputs. In static CG models, the key inputs are the social accounting metrics, which provides the structure for the model, and then the elasticities, which inform the behavior of various agents in the model. The CG model itself consists of a number of equations which capture the theoretical specifications of the model. as well as includes the various closure rules. The outputs of CG models are usually large. Again, it's dependent on the information that's in the SAM, but they can include information on sector production and GVA, GDP by expenditure component, factor use and returns, institution income, expenditure and savings, impacts on trade, and then also relative price changes in the economy. So the social accounting matrix, or SAM, is a representation of the circular flow of funds in the economy. So if we consider the product and factor markets, the SAM captures the firm's production or supply of products to the markets through its sales revenues. But firms also interact with product markets through the demand for goods and services, which is called the intermediate demand. To produce goods and services, firms also require the use of factors such as labor and capital, in addition to intermediate goods and services. So we therefore also see a payment to factor markets. The owners of the owners of factors are households. So returns to factors such as wages and capital returns are therefore sources of income to households. This income is spent on the consumption of goods and services supplied by product markets. In addition to consumption, households also pay taxes to government and save a portion of their incomes. And while it's not shown here in this illustrative diagram, households also transfer funds to the rest of the world. The role of government is captured through its receipt of taxes. So in this flow diagram, we only show direct taxes from households, although the full SAM and CG model include tax revenues from company tax, import customs, sales tax, and activity taxes, where activity taxes also include information on any subsidies that are received. Government also consumes goods and services, and they also contribute to total savings in the economy. So savings from the private sector and government, along with foreign savings, provide a pool of funds for investment. And through investment spending, consumption of goods and services such as the use of construction services or machinery also takes place. So the combination of our private, government, and investment consumption makes up the total demand for goods and services in the economy. In addition to this, the country also exports goods and services and imports goods and services. And imports form part of the goods and services available for domestic consumption from product markets. So what this slide shows is a simplified illustration of a SAM in matrix format. So this is just generally the format in which we have SAMs that go into the CG model. And the SAM is an efficient format for describing the circular flow of funds and hence the economic structure. So as you can see, it includes the various accounts and economic agents that we just discussed before. The way we read a SAM is that the row entries are read as receipts of income and the column entries are read as payments. So as an example, activities or firms pay product markets or as labeled here, commodities for the intermediate inputs they use. They also pay factors which accounts which make up the value added, and pay taxes, and taxes here represent taxes but also subsidies that are received. In turn, activities earn revenues from the outputs they sell. For some countries, households consume products that they produce themselves. An example of this is subsistence agriculture. And so this entry would show up in the SAM in the row activities and the column households. A key feature of the SAM is the principle of double entry accounting, which requires that each account in the SAM, for each account in the SAM, the total revenue. So the total row columns, the totals on the row columns must equal the totals on the totals on the columns, but equal the total on the rows. And this provides the accounting consistency for the SAM. So as I said, I'll be focusing on the IFPRI model. So why are there these standard models? So the motivation is that by having a common core model, you avoid reinventing the wheel. It's also quick to get up and start using CG models for countries, because you just have to include the country-specific SAM and certain elasticities for that country. It's versatile as it's able to capture the most unique country characteristics, and it's also flexible in the sense that you can add complexity or special country characteristics. Having a standard model also makes it easier to debug and enables easier sharing of what you're doing with others. The key characteristics of the IFPRI model is that it's neoclassical in structure. The standard model is static and includes perfect competition. It does have activities and commodities distinguished, so that enables single sector or single activities to produce multiple products, or a single commodity to be produced by multiple producers. There's an option for the inclusion of household consumption of non-marketed commodities. There's the explicit treatment of transaction costs for commodities. There are specific wages and also imperfect substitutes on foreign trade. Okay, so the structure of the CG model follows that of the SAM. So the model is written in a set of simultaneous equations, with these equations defining the behavior of various economic agents. In this presentation, I'm not going to go into the mathematical notation of the model, but for those interested, you can have a look at the IFPRI paper by Lofgren called the Standard Computable General Equilibrium Model in GAMS, and they provide you with the full mathematical model there. So at the production level, or what we call here the factory, producers use factors of production. Here we include labor and capital, although you can have other factors of production. So they use these with intermediate inputs to produce an output. Production decisions are nonlinear, and the first optimal order condition from the profit maximizing behavior is included in the CGE model. And producers produce outputs up to the point where the marginal revenue of the output is equal to the marginal cost of producing. Like I said, sectors can produce multiple products, and multiple sectors can produce the same product. So we have the factory or the producers which supply products to an imaginary warehouse, if you will. And in this warehouse, the products are the same type of combined to provide the domestic supply of goods and services. At this point, domestically produced goods and services can either be exported, or they can be combined with imports to get to the total supply available to the domestic market. This total supply is then consumed by final and intermediate consumers. So final consumers are households, government investment, and then the intermediate consumption is that of the producers. So the loop is closed by the intermediate demand from producers, and then also the incomes that households received from the provision of production factors. So at each step of the model, the quantities and relative prices are captured. So you can see in the green text, there are a number of quantities and prices included in the model. Variables for quantities start with the letter Q, and the others are prices. So at the factory level, which is this block over here, we have the prices of production, which include the prices for factors of production, and these can be different for different sectors, as well, and also the price of intermediate goods and services. At the warehouse level, activity prices for the same commodities are combined, and with transaction costs for getting goods from the factory to the warehouse, that gives us the domestic supply and domestic demand prices. The model also distinguishes between export and import prices, which also account for transaction costs related to these. Import prices are combined with domestic demand prices to get to the composited price, which is what the final users pay at the supermarket level. So the way in which the various parts of the model is combined determines the behavior of the economic agents. So like I said, the model includes the production function as well as the household consumption function. But within that, the standard model also uses nested functions to try and capture or try and better capture some real world complexity. So the types of functional forms that are used in the standard model is the leontief. So that's basically fixed shares are used to combine, for example, intermediate inputs of producers. So you can think of that as a recipe for baking a cake. You have to use a certain amount of eggs, a certain amount of flour, etc. So those proportions stay the same. And leontief structures are also also used to combine products from various producers and the consumption by government and investment. The constant elasticity of substitution allows for changes in shares that are used based on changes in relative prices. So this is, for example, used on the capital and labor consumption of producers. So if capital becomes cheaper, producers can switch to using more capital and less labor to produce a single unit of output. But there are elasticities that control the extent of these shifts. The Armington and constant elasticity of trade functions are used within the trade component of the model. So the Armington function is a type of a CES that governs the change in imports for a given relative price change between imports and domestically produced goods. The Armington function also enables the idea of imperfect substitution between domestic and foreign goods. And then the CET is also an application of the CES, and it's used to govern how much of domestic goods and services are exported versus how much we consume domestically based on the relative prices of the two. Lastly, for households, a linear expenditure system, which is derived from the Stone-Gdede utility function, is used to govern household consumption in the standard IFPRI model. So as I said, the model has various macroeconomic closures and these, macroeconomic and factor closures. And these closure rules ensure macroeconomic consistency in the model. Again, to give an example, the amount of labor that's demanded at a particular price must equal the total quantity of labor in the economy. So if the demand is higher, then either the price must adjust upward or the supply of labor must increase. They also give CG models the ability to reflect a variety of macroeconomic contexts. So earlier we spoke about different types of CG models, them being Keynesian or neoclassical. So in the standard IFPRI model, there are 3 key macroeconomic closures, and then there's a factor closure. So the macroeconomic closures are on investment and savings. So you can choose from the closures that are available whether investment is savings driven or whether the level of investment drives how much saving takes place in the economy. And then there's also the option to have a more balanced approach where you fix investment to some share of absorption. On the government account, you can have government spending being fixed, in which case tax rates adjust, or you can have government spending being flexible and you keep your tax rates fixed. On the current account, there's the option to have a fixed exchange rate or to have fixed foreign savings. And then on the factor account, so this is for labor and capital and any other production factors that might be included, there's the option to have these factors either fully employed or unemployed. Depending on the closure, you have your wages would adjust. And then factors can also be mobile or activity specific, and that would affect the relative returns of factors. So the way we choose closures when we do CG modeling is that we try and fit them as best as possible to the stylized characteristics of the economy. But we also have to take into account the question that we're trying to answer. So, for example, if we want to assess the impact of an exchange rate shock, we couldn't have the exchange rate being flexible in the model. So in terms of how the standard model sort of the files look, the data file goes into the model file, which is a system of equations. There's a number of diagnostic tests that are done to ensure that the data that's included in the model is behaving correctly. The model is then initialized, and then we solve the model in order to replicate the base data. So as I said, static models are single period models. So this is only done once. And then if you want to look at various scenarios, these would be included through a simulation file, which would place the disturbances in the model file and then solve for the outcomes. So those were static CG models. But we also get dynamic CG models. So static models are unable to account for second period considerations. So that limits the assessment of looking at the full effect of policy and non-policy changes. So for that reason, the static model is extended to a recursive dynamic model. So in essence, what that is, it's solving the static model for a number of periods. The way these models work is that they use the results from previous periods along with exogenous inputs on certain variables such as population or total factor productivity. And also there's an endogenous updating of capital stock. So just to show this a little bit more visually, period 0 here presents the static model that solves. So you have your base SAM. The model is calibrated and solved so that you get a model solution, which is basically the replication of the base data. When we run dynamic models in the next period, the outcomes from period 0 is used within the model, both as the starting solution, but then also to update the capital available to various sectors. Exogenous assumptions are also included, like I said, on population growth, total factor productivity, changes in government transfer growth. And then using this information, the CG model is solved to get the solution for period 1. And in this way, the CG model basically runs over time for however many time periods you determine until you get to your final time period. Just to zone into the capital updating process. So the way that capital is endogenously updated in the CG model is that the investment spending from the previous period is turned into capital stock. And then that capital stock is then divided or given to various sectors in the economy. And the way that this capital stock is sort of divvied up to sectors is based on the initial share of aggregate capital income in our base data set, the capital depreciation rate, and then also the sectoral profit rate differentials. So what that means is that if iron and steel outperforms paper and printing, for example, then in the following period, iron and steel would be able to attract more capital than what the paper industry would. One of the other features of the CG model is that you can also fix the capital stock of certain sectors. So this is something that we do in the energy-linked economy model. So in the energy-linked model, the energy model tells us what the required investment and capital is in the electricity sector. So we are able to use that inputs and input it into the CG model to determine the capital for that sector over time. But what that means for the rest of sectors is that whatever capital is left over after we take these fixed capital sectors out of the equation, that gets divvied up to those sectors. So in terms of looking at the results in dynamic CG models, so you can see from this graph that we have a baseline path, and this is basically the calibrated path that we use as our reference case for the model. And then we have our scenario. And the impact of a policy or shock over time is the deviation between these two growth paths. So what this means is that a negative result when you're calculating this deviation does not necessarily mean a contraction, but rather could mean a slowdown relative to your baseline path or your reference case. Okay, so I'm going to switch quickly to looking at CGE models and their application for climate change. So CGE models are appropriate to look at climate change issues because they are real economy models with a focus on the supply side. And climate change and climate actions have strong supply side effects. They are economy-wide, so they enable us to look at direct, indirect, and induced effects. They have the macroeconomic and resource constraints, and these are crucial for when you're looking at large-scale policy or shocks to the economy. They also provide indicators of interest to policy analysts. And because of the nature of climate change, there's greater demand for the use of structural models as opposed to statistically estimated reduced form models, as the latter relies on historical patterns or experience. Analyzing or analysis using CG models have been enhanced through linking with other models and the inclusions of CG models in integrated assessment models. And these IAM models have become sort of standard tools when looking at climate change analysis. So some examples of the models that are out there are MESSAGE, IEPRI, and SACRED, among others. So I'm going to just focus on 3 applications of CG models. So the first one that I'll be looking at is a carbon tax, or looking at the impact of a carbon tax. So this was a paper that was developed by Alton and others, and specifically it looked at introducing carbon tax in South Africa. It assesses the carbon tax and different rates at different rates and using different recycling schemes on the South African economy. The model that was used was a dynamic CG model, which had an energy hybridized SAM, and it also included an exogenous power plan for the electricity sector, as well as changes in energy efficiency over time and emissions intensity factors, which allowed for the calculation of carbon emissions in the model. So there were 3 scenarios that were looked at: tax on fossil fuel commodities, which was called the production scenario. Then there was one that added to the production scenario by including border tax adjustments. And then there was also one that looked at the impact of South Africa doing nothing but the rest of the world implementing carbon taxes and border tax adjustments and the implications that this would have. In terms of outputs, the key outputs from the paper were emissions, sector GDP and employment, and then also household impacts. So I'm not going to go into the sort of full details of the paper, but the one thing that I do want to highlight is the figure on the bottom right-hand screen of the graph. So this shows the change in household consumption by decile, with the last decile split into 5 different groups. So you can see that CG models are able to look at the distributional change of something like a carbon tax or considering the different ways in which the revenues from the carbon tax can be recycled. So for this paper, a corporate tax, sales tax, foreign tax, and social transfers were considered. The dynamic CG model has also been used to look at the impacts of increased renewable energy in South Africa. So there were 2 papers that were sort of a part 1 and part 2 that was developed under the SATI program. And the work looked at the impacts of constrained versus unconstrained renewable energy capacity inclusions. So specifically, the linked energy economic model was used, where the economic model was a dynamic CG model. And the key impact channels to the CG model were power investment and the power price, changes in the fuel types used. So the energy model would tell the economic model whether less coal was being used and more other fuel types being used. And then also there was the passing of information on energy efficiency. In terms of the scenarios, the paper looked at a constrained solar PV and wind capacity addition scenario relative to an unconstrained scenario. And then it also looked at the difference of whether we consider conservative or optimistic prices. The outputs from the modeling effort on the energy side included impacts on emissions, investment requirements, electricity prices, and then on the economic side, looked at sector GDP, employment, and household impacts. So key feature or key outcome from the study was that because of the decrease in the cost of renewable energy, when you constrain how much solar PV and wind you allow to be added to the system, you are actually negatively affecting economic growth. So the graph here on the bottom right shows the change in GDP and employment in an unconstrained scenario relative to a constrained scenario. And then the third application that I'm going to show is an application looking at the impacts of climate change on South Africa. So this was work that was done for the long-term adaptation strategies by Calibration et al. And then there was also some more analysis done under the TSITICA program to unpack the agricultural sector a bit. So the purpose of the work was to look at the impacts of climate change on the South African economy. It used a dynamic CGE model within an IAM framework. The CG model was regional, it had water detail, and it also had agricultural detail, where a distinction was made between irrigated versus rain-fed agriculture. And the way that the CG model fit into sort of the framework was that the outputs from the biophysical models fed into the economic model as exogenous inputs. So there were three key biophysical impacts that were considered. The first was water availability by end use. So within the CG model, there was a water detail, or rather water was captured as a factor of production. So changes from the biophysical model would affect the supply and demand for the water factor. For rain-fed crop yields, the outputs from a crop model provided information about how the rain-fed yields would change under different climate conditions. And that information is used to inform the productivity of crop agricultural sectors in the CG model. And then for road infrastructure, this impacted the economy or fed into the CG model through the impact on productivity. So the scenarios that were considered in the paper were scenarios looking at the impacts of climate change. So we had scenarios with and without climate change. And then some of the outputs that came from the study were impacts on sector GDP and employment, household impacts. And these were also done at the regional at a water management level. So you can see that from the top right-hand graph. And what the bottom graph shows us is how household real food consumption can change because of impacts of climate change. And again, this is by region. Yeah, so that's sort of the presentation I put together for today. Yeah, thank you. And I'm not sure if there are any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Faaiqa. Very interesting presentation, clarifies a lot. Are there any hands up yet? I can't see any on the list yet.
No hands yet.
Someone seems to be talking though. No?
Mark has his hand up.
Okay, Mark, please go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Faaiqa. It's a really good talk. Every time I listen to one of these, I start to understand more and more about how these beasts actually work. So thank you very much for that. So I guess I've got two questions. One is just around sort of some of the sort of perfect market sort of assumptions in here, and the second, and how that might sort of lead to unrealistic results from a model. If you think of, you know, the way a real economy works, and you know, so I guess a lot of that comes into the elasticity issues you were talking about. But so I just had a question about whether, you know, whether the assumptions of around those are valid for the real world, and how sensitive some of the results might be to the assumptions in there. And then the second question is, how often are these kinds of models used in climate science? We talk about it in terms of a hindcast sort of effect. So basically, you can use a climate model to sort of to predict the season, to predict the season ahead, and then you can test how good the model was. So I'm just thinking about, you know, like a shock to the system that we've had now with COVID or whatever. Do you guys actually start to test whether the model can actually represent the real results in the economy if you include that shock into the system, or do you always work in a kind of a hypothetical world, if you like? And yeah, and it'd be nice if you could perhaps just go into a bit more detail on the climate impacts one study about what the actual inputs are into the model, into the CG model. So your kind of biophysical models would give you sort of potential changes in, say, crop yields or something like that. And I'd just be interested to understand how you translate that into, I guess, the numbers in your social accounting matrix, for instance. Yeah. So sorry, three questions. Sorry to lump those on you.
Yep. Sorry, I've just lost my Zoom screen. There we go. Thanks, Mark, for those questions. Those are very interesting and difficult questions. Thank you. So on the perfect market assumption, you're right that under assuming perfect competition, you are assuming that all resources are able to flow efficiently in the economy. And we know that in the real world that doesn't happen, or doesn't happen in that way. So the impacts from CG models might show the impact as maybe being a bit more positive if those frictions do exist in the economy. But like I pointed out, a lot of what CG models, or the intention or use of CG models, is try and determine the direction of the impact, and not necessarily the exact impact. And then also to try and help us think about how the shocks or the policy changes that we're looking at, how those affect the economy. So what are the knock-on effects? What are the possible impacts that these could have on the economy? So yes, perfect market assumption is not optimal, and there are models that do have imperfect competition in them, but like the current model or the IFPRI model that we're currently working with that is based on perfect competition. In terms of the testing of the models, so the COVID one is a very interesting, case, and because CG models are structural in their nature, they're not forecasting models, so they don't they're not looking ahead and trying to predict the future. They rather simulatory laboratories where you, in your reference case, you say, well, if everything remains the same, this is what the future will look like. But if we have this disturbance, then this is the impact that this disturbance would have on the economy. There have been papers that have, for example, looked at modeling the financial crisis in CG models. But because these are not forecasting tools, generally they're not tested to sort of see how well they predicted, if that makes sense. There was a study that was done a number of years ago, but I forget what the outcomes were. But I can find it and send that or provide you a summary of that paper. But basically, what the study looked at was that it combined a number of SAMs over time, and it tried to make the CG model go through those SAMs. So it was using actual historical data to try and calibrate the SAM and then look at how the various parameters in the SAM would change based on the information that it got from different years. So I know that that was done. I wasn't personally involved in that. And then just to go back to, sorry, I'm going to share my screen again, just to go back to the alt stuff. Can you see that?
Yes,
okay,
we can see.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So with the ALTAS work, the reference case for the biophysical models as well as for the CG model was based on sort of like historical weather patterns. So the information about how water supply in the reference case changed over time also came from these biophysical models. So that sort of gave a reference case to the growth in water supply over time, for example, or the factor water over time, for example. And then in the scenarios that were modeled, the biophysical model, let's use the water model, the biophysical water model would look at the change in water supply under the various climate scenarios. And then the percentage change in that factor, or the availability of that factor, would be passed on to the economic model to give us the change in the availability of water as a factor for production. And then for crops, because this particular model had, I think it was 9 or 7 different agricultural crops that it included, the biophysical crop production model was able to assess the impacts on productivity from climate action for various crops. So in the CGE model, in your production function for each crop, you have the crop using capital and labor and other and water and other intermediate goods and services. And you also have a technology coefficient on that production function. And so the change in productivity for the particular crops, again, it was measured as a deviation from the baseline, so the climate scenario deviation from the baseline, and that change was fed into the productivity for that particular crop. So in a climate where crop yields went down, or let's say maize crop yields went down, then in the CGE model, the total factor productivity of maize crop production in the CGE model would be lower than what it would be in the baseline scenario. I'm describing it quite simplistically because there was sort of a time dimension to it where adaptive expectations were taken into account. But I'm going to stop there for now. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, I think that's good enough for now. Thanks, Faaiqa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Faaiqa. Dave Gordon's got his hand up. Dave?
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk, Faaiqa. Could you say a little bit more about the technological coefficient? Because when you link the production to the biophysical model to the CEG model to look at the effect of changes in water availability and agriculture over a reasonably long time horizon, how does it account for potential technological changes which might be part of the adaptation to that change in water availability?
The technical coefficients that we used in that study specifically was the total factor production. And those coefficients came from, or those changes came from a water supply demand model, which was run by Audicon. So I don't know the details exactly of that model, but perhaps I can explain it to you from a mitigation perspective in terms of the energy-linked economic model. So in the energy model, accounts for changes in efficiency over time. And so similarly to that, it gives that information to the economic model by, on the production side, changing how much of the various fuels are being used for both production as well as for households. So it's basically, for the climate work, it was a coefficient, and you just adjust that coefficient by the shock that you're including. Is that, I don't know if that's answering what you're asking. Sorry.
Well, I just, if it's over, say, 50 or 100 years, you'd expect agricultural technology to maybe get better over that time. And was there any kind of discount for that potential for introducing water drought-resistant crops or better water irrigation management?
Through that adaptative expectations, yes, there was. I think it was based on a 10-year moving average of what happens to crop yields. And then there would be some assumption made about the new investment that is made, whether that investment allows for the sector to be more efficient or not. And then we've got something similar to that on the older energy model, because now the energy model just gives directly the inputs to the economic model. But that energy efficiency due to improved technologies can be accounted for, but it has to be set up in the model. It's not something that is endogenously there.
Thanks, Hatsa.
Thanks. Murray's got his hand up. Murray?
Yeah, and just to follow on a little bit from that, but not so much on the technology side, on the household block, which comes from the household surveys. And maybe you can talk about that a bit. And so whether there's some way of splicing in, giving some subtlety to the demand side, to who's using the water and the assets and the, you know, and the who are the small farmers and which deciles are they in, and you know, that side of the model. Thanks.
Yes, the household surveys are used when we disaggregate the macro SAM. So it depends on the SAM that you're looking at, but generally households are disaggregated to have various groups of households. And the information from household surveys are usually used to inform the consumption and the income sources of that. The household survey information is used in terms of the shares. So we're not using the actual levels because there is some discrepancy between the national accounts data and the survey information that we have. So just get my train of thought. Sorry, Mary, could you remind me what the second part of that was again?
No, it was just about linking in the actual assets that the households use. They're factors of production, but for the household rather than for the economy. You know, like the assets that households use for livelihoods.
Yes. So CG models that are flow models. So they don't include stocks, and assets or wealth would be a stock variable. I'm in the current sort of IFPRI-based model that it's not there. Yeah, and it's, it would be something to think about in terms of how those stocks could be incorporated, and maybe that is something that can be thought about on the microsimulation side. So the idea would be you have the survey data that provides a simulatory liability of households, and that information or that model can include things on assets that households have or wealth that they have. And then if we impose the macroeconomic shocks onto that, we could see how that maybe affects those things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Faaiqa. If there are no other questions, I will ask one. So I'm quite intrigued by the distributive aspects of this. So you say you can see what it does in terms of whatever, like now if you're looking into the climate impacts, for example, if you check food prices and what it does in terms of GDP and employment, right? I just wonder if you could unpack that a bit from like a poverty perspective. So we've heard Mari about multidimensional poverty. We've heard Dave Gordon the other day about multidimensional poverty indices. And I remember there was this model that he's talked about the influx of resources, poverty and deprivation. So I wondered if you could contextualize that a bit in terms of what if we stay with the example of food prices, what it is that we can understand in terms of poverty in the livelihoods that you're looking at, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
So if we're thinking about changes in prices, so if food prices increase, there'll be an impact on how much, well, this is also dependent on the household demand elasticity. So food is generally not something that is very elastic. It's usually very inelastic. So if food prices go up, households don't necessarily change their food consumption by as much. But that being said, the prices would have an impact on how much food is consumed by households, and we'll be able to see the impact of that across the different household representative groups that we have. And then that change in demand has an impact for production, because in CG models, because they're equilibrium-based models, supply and demand must be equal. So it will have an impact on how much food gets produced. And if food production is being decreased, that could have an impact on the amount of capital or employment being used, or at least the returns to those factors of production, which in turn again have an impact on household incomes. And that again affects household consumption. So if we're thinking about poverty specifically, what you'll be able to look at is how households' real consumption changes because of changes in their incomes, but also in changes of, but also because of changes in the prices that they face, and how households potentially shift their consumption, maybe away from more luxury items to food, for example. You can see if that happens. Yeah, and then you can look at that over time, and you'll, if you include a metric of some poverty line, you'll be able to look at the household per capita consumption relative to that poverty line and how it changes, and that would be able to give you some sort of indication of the change in poverty. Because the household groupings in CG models are quite aggregate, so they're deciles. It's not as informative as if you're looking at more disaggregated information. So if you linking the outputs to a microsimulation model, you have far more representative households, and so you'll be able to say something a bit more meaningful, perhaps, on the change in poverty.
Cool, thanks a lot. Let's take one last question, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Faaiqa. I was just thinking back to that impact study there, and I know that everything was simulated at the catchment management scale. So I guess if you like, the impacts model would have probably a change in maize yield in each of those catchments. But do you then aggregate that up into a single number in the CEG, or is it disaggregated? So I'm just thinking about how one could look at the spatial distribution economically. So you can imagine, there's a country like Ghana that goes from humid in the south to almost to semi-arid in the north, and assuming maize production is the same and it's going to have the same impact on kind of sub-national economies across the different parts of the country is quite a major assumption if one was going to aggregate everything. So yeah, is there a way to deal with that sort of regionalization of the economy, if you like?
Yeah. The regionalization of the economy is at the activity level. So it affects the production of a crop being produced for every region. Let's say if there's maize in every region, then the change in the yield for that region would be affected, which would impact the production in that region. In terms of the commodity market, the model still assumed that there was one commodity market. So each region's maize production would go to that commodity market, and then from there, various final demand users would consume. So there's still one price for the maize commodity, but it aggregates what is happening in the different regions. So that's sort of on the commodity side in terms of how the prices are affected and how that affects households' consumption from a pricing point of view. But then regionally, what is done is that for every region, there was labor and capital for households in that region. So the impact on household incomes were very much affected by what was happening within the region, even though its reaction to prices was sort of there was an economy-wide average price.
So if I was thinking about, going back to the distributional impacts, you could basically be, in addition to doing it across income deciles, you could actually, is it right, you could have income deciles for each region if one wanted to get to that level of detail, basically. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. I do want to highlight though that this was this was for the SAM that was used specifically for the ALTAS project, and that SAM was built by James Thurlow, and it's quite outdated. It was from 2002, but you could get regional impacts, and you could compare how different households do across regions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's all very interesting, because that level of integration would also be good to explore in working package 2 and 4 in terms of our linkages that we have there. I just wanted to ask everybody if there are more questions, because I think we had scheduled the webinar till 3, and then we had an internal team meeting tacked onto it till 3:30, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the questions. So last chance for any hands ups. Faaiqa is gonna share the slides. We'll put the recording up, so you can always reach out if anything else comes to mind. Otherwise, no, last chance. Okay, then I would want to say goodbye to everyone who kindly joined us externally. And then for everyone who's on the project to stay for the internal discussion.